Welcome to Farming for Health, where Farmer Lee Jones and I talk with leaders in food, farming, and health and wellness to spread knowledge and inspire a plant-forward future, starting now. Welcome to Farming for Health. I'm Dr. Amy Sapola, and today I'm joined by Jeremy Umansky, chef of Larder Delicatessen in Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you, Jeremy, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Amy.
Yeah. So first, I love to get people to share just their story. Like, how did you get to where you are? How did you become a chef? And how did you become so good at foraging?
Oh man, I'm covered in mushrooms today. I wore the perfect hoodie.
I know. That's amazing.
Um, so I think it all goes back to really strong family food traditions for me. So much so my grandmother was a kosher caterer, one of the synagogues on the east side of Cleveland. And at a very early age, I was in the kitchen with her, uh, cooking the luncheons, washing the dishes, feeding the congregation. And my love of food really kind of blossomed and thrived through there. I remember too, my grandmother would always make fantastic gefilte fish. Her gefilte fish recipe's awesome. And a lot of people don't necessarily like gefilte fish because it's always cooked horribly. So I always grew up with this like fantastic gefilte fish. And even as a kid, I realized that was something special, that like our family had good gefilte fish. Like something was right, you
I
know?
love that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was pretty early on that I was able to latch onto some of that. So, as time went on, my mother was instrumental too. My mother's a fantastic cook, and I remember she was a charter subscription to Food and Wine magazine when it launched in the '80s.
Okay.
And like one of her most prized possessions, still to this day, was their yearly hardcover cookbook that they put out with all the recipes from the year. She has this fantastic collection of all of them from the beginning to pretty much until now. So she was always trying different recipes, and she did a lot of great cooking. And my mom was an avid gardener with us when we were younger, and knew a few wild plants that would pop up in the garden, and we'd go pick blackberries down the street and that sort of thing. So all of these things were really implanted in me, from an early age. As I got older and decided I was working on a degree in cultural anthropology. And I figured, oh, well, maybe I'll go become an academic and get a doctorate in culinary anthropology and work on that. And that's essentially that's still a dream. Hopefully,
Oh,
after
cool.
my chef day bones, after working on that line, I can't do it much anymore. Hopefully, I'll be able to go back for that. But I decided culinary school was the best route, and from there things just took off for me. A number of things in culinary school happened at the same time. I was running a 40-acre vegetable farm as the land manager, and I ended up doing that for just about 7 seasons.
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to culinary school. I was working various jobs with different chefs, and through farming and agriculture and working with some of these different chefs in different places, I was learning about mushrooms with professor emeritus of biology at SUNY New Paltz, and um, got introduced to Gary Linkoff down in New York City, who was the author of the North American Guide to Mushrooms for Audubon. So I was hanging out with some of these guys through the farm via associations with the ag school in New York City, and the owner of the farm, and all these wonderful things. And also at that time too, I was very active with slow food. Ended up being one of the leads, one of the Coke and Vivium leaders for Slow Food Hudson Valley, which was one of the biggest chapters in the country at that time. Very active with them and what they were doing. And through them, I was introduced to a fermentation guru named Sander Katz, who has been a mentor, not just for me, but for, at this point, millions of people around the world, as far as fermented foods go and the production of them and the enjoyment of them. So I got to spend time with Sander and show him around the Hudson Valley and do a lot of work with him. And literally all these things were happening all at once. So it became very clear to me what I wanted to do in food and kind of the career path I wanted to take. The problem was at that time, there were no jobs available outside of some very, very exclusive, far flung locations that did ultra fine dining. So I set apart a goal of showing that restaurants, small family owned businesses, they could employ a larder master or a fermentation specialist or a forager into their model, into their food program, just as these other restaurants are doing, just on a kind of a bit of a different scale, a bit of a different way. And I think that's kind of what's landed us to where we are now.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh, what a journey. And so many things you are saying, I'm like, oh, that could be like its own podcast, right? Like, that is so awesome. When it comes to foraging, I know I went out foraging with you, and you even offer like local foraging classes, which I think are so cool. One of the things I was blown away by is you have a memory like a dictionary. Like, you really like know things and are able to identify so easily. How did you build that knowledge? And like, where do you recommend people even start with foraging?
So, with something like that, it's just like any other skill that you may develop, whether it's intuitive to you or it's a learned skill that you really have to focus on. And a lot of it's through repetition. It
Mm-hmm.
takes years and years and years to accumulate these sets of knowledge where you can work with things in these ways. I mean, you're a doctor. It's not something that just happens overnight. This absorption of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
the repetition of it, the reworking of it, and it's very different too from like going from a book into the real world.
Yeah.
There's field work is very different than academic work, and they're both academic work, but than lab work per se. So I often liken it to how did someone learn to drive a car, right?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't just one day grab some keys and go and just start going. There'd be some issues there, with your parents, with the law, so on and so forth. So you have to go through training, you have to study, you have to learn all the road signs, you have to learn what means what, where you're going, and you have to understand the responsibility of a several ton piece of metal being driven down the road at 60 miles an hour. There's a lot of liability and responsibility with that. So, likening foraging, especially with wild mushrooms, to that really clicks with a lot of people. It's like, oh, well, if I keep doing this and keep doing this and studying it and studying it, and practice it, study it and practice it, study it and practice it, eventually you accumulate a knowledge base where you can go out. And this isn't for everything. And keep in mind, I'm a specialist in my area.
Mm-hmm.
So if me and you were to go to the West Coast and go hiking, around Yosemite, I'd know a fair amount of what's out there. But as but pertains to our biosphere here around the Great Lakes and in Northeast Ohio, it's drastically different, even though there are similarities. So, you take whatever it is out of its environment and you place it in someplace new, is statistically its chances for survival aren't always the best.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I like that you say you're a specialist in your area, because I think sometimes it's overwhelming to think of like all of the different potential mushrooms out there and wild plants, and like, oh my gosh, how do I learn all of them? And maybe it's just starting. Like, maybe it's just knowing one that you can be really confident in identifying.
And that's what it is, and building your way up from there.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely encourage people too, with the identification of wild fungi and wild plants, or even domesticated ones, for that matter, that are in your yard that you just don't know what they are. Maybe somebody planted a bush years ago in front of your house and you're like, I have no clue what that thing is. It's pretty, I like it, but I'd like to know what it is so I can take care of it better. Learn how to identify a plant, a fungi, any of these organisms from a written description. That's going to be like your most helpful way, the best way for you to learn how to identify something. And the reason for this, and I hear from people, oh, well, I'm a visual learner, I'm a tactile learner. This, reading isn't always the best for me. Well, here's the issue. When it comes to the identification of these thriving living organisms, there's a lot of difference in them and how they appear in the field.
Mm.
So if you can read a description that kind of covers all the bases of the variability of how they could look, maybe sometimes a mushroom has when it's young and fresh, a bright red cap, but after a few days and maybe a little lack of moisture after that mushroom appears, that cap turns like a burnt sienna or almost brown color. And it's like, well, if you found it a couple days earlier, you'd be comparing it to a picture with a red capped one. Finding it when you found it, it'd be a brown capped one. But if you follow a written description that says there's variability in cap color from this shade to that shade, you can't get that from a picture. As much as a picture tells 1,000 words, when it comes to living, breathing organisms that you're trying to identify and that change wildly in the outdoor environments they're in, the picture is not the best way to go. The written description is, and then follow through with the picture.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a good tip. And when it comes to mushrooms, like what are a couple of your favorites to forage and how do you like to use them?
That's a really, really good question. Um, well, so there's some that I like to forage for personal use.
Mm-hmm.
That more or less like honestly, unless you're at an expert level of certification, or above, I necessarily wouldn't mess with. And I like in the summer finding like there's this whole Cesare mushroom complex, Amanita Cesare, which is European, and over here they call it Amanita Jacksoni. And recent years, the taxonomy for it's insane. There's all these crazy breakdowns. They're like, oh, if it grows in this state, it's actually a separate species now
Oh my
because
gosh.
we can look at the DNA. It's a mess with the taxonomy. It's changing so fast that almost nobody can keep up, especially field researchers. But um, finding these mushrooms is like really, really thrilling and fun. And they're in a family, a group of mushrooms that has a lot of deadly toxic relatives.
Oh.
But not all the mushrooms in this family produce these toxins, and this is one of them. So it's really, really fun, and it's a really cool tasting mushroom. It has these mushrooms tend to have zinc esque nuances to them.
Oh,
So
interesting.
they do really fun plays in like really acidic dishes because they bring this like zinky battery jolt of acid kind of to things. So you can play with how acidity hits the tongue.
Wow.
It's a really fun mushroom. So I really love that. I really love fungi that eat other fungi.
Oh, cool.
So kind of this time of year, Entoloma abortivum, which they call the abortive Entoloma. They used to call the aborted, but now they call it the abortive. It is actually, from as much as we understand at this point, it is attacking the mycelium, the rooting network of another mushroom, and it kind of infiltrates it. And the other mushroom is an edible mushroom, but it's a parasitic mushroom that can destroy forests if it goes unchecked, depending on the type of forest it is. So it's the natural balance to keep this mushroom that kills trees in check, and it forms these little aborted growths that look like shrimp tails, but they're stark white,
Oh my
and they have a
gosh.
texture that's kind of like shrimp. So people call it shrimp of the woods. They also call it hunter's heart, and so a mushroom that eats another mushroom. That's really fascinating to me. I love that, and
Yeah.
I I'd be remiss if I didn't say morels. I mean, my eldest daughter, one of her middle names is Morcella, which is the Latin name for the morel family. So we're really into those here.
Oh, that's amazing. How cool. You have the best answer ever. That's, yeah, I haven't heard of at least two of the three, so that's so cool. I know, speaking of your daughter or daughters, that
Yeah.
you love teaching like family foraging, and I'd love to dive a little bit more into that. Like, how do you safely teach kids about foraging?
Yeah, I think a big thing about it is establishing the number one rule. And this rule extends to grown-ups too, but we phrase it a little differently. And that rule is always ask a grown-up. All right? And if we're telling this rule to adults, we say always ask a professional. All right?
Yeah.
So right away, the kids really, really get down with that. They really understand it. I think the big thing with family foraging too is getting parents to understand that things like toxicity are a sliding scale. Okay. There are things that will kill people. That's a given, right? There's wild animals,
Hmm.
but we also have, in the middle of the city, have lead poisoning and air pollution. So, any environment you're going into nowadays, whether it's a terraformed 21st century environment or it's a wild one that is left, and hopefully we can continue preserving those areas.
Yeah.
These environments, there's things that will poison you and kill you that you have to be aware of. So one of the big things that we try to get parents to understand is the sliding scale of toxicity, that not everything is going to do that. So at first, it's very important, if you're going to be learning about edible things, you have to learn about the most toxic things too. So learning about those two things at the same time are very, very important. We do this in a way that the parents are understanding and in a way that the kids are comfortable and can explore, right? The big thing is getting the parents comfortable with the environment. And a big thing with that is the discussion about plants. Most parents are willy-nilly to let their kids just touch plants and that sort of thing. And when I explain to them that the fungi can only injure their children if they get it in their bloodstream. So either if they eat it or if they happen to have an open cut that a large amount gets mashed into somehow. It has to get internal. Whereas plants are covered in thorns, they have saps that will give you horrible rashes. I mean, if a small child nibbled on a poison ivy leaf, that's far worse consequence than I think the ingestion of most of the fungi that grow year round. The really deadly ones only grow for kind of a short window of time and at a specific time of year for the most part. Of the ones that we have around the Great Lakes area. So compare that to poison ivy, which is literally out for 9 months of the year. It has leaves on it here.
Yeah.
And it's much more metropolitan and ubiquitous in various environments. So, when we kind of dissect those things and we show parents, the areas to focus on, areas that are typically great and don't contain some of these plants are like the best areas to forage with kids, and that's in an open lawn.
Yeah.
Almost any grass, clover, quote unquote weed that happens to grow in your yard, for the most part in our area, is going to be safe to ingest. It may not be delicious, but it will be safe to ingest. So, just really the big approach, like I said, is getting parents comfortable with the idea that their children can explore and do it in a safe way, and that not everybody's going to die. That's the big thing. So,
Yeah. That's
and
huge.
yeah, and we liked it with the family forage. We like to teach, blackberries and raspberries are great because there's nothing they can be confused with. If it looks like a blackberry or raspberry, as long as you wash it, it's safe to eat.
Yeah.
So that's a good one. Learning some clovers that grow in the glass and dandelion greens and these sorts of things there's a lot that's very simplistically approachable, and the kids love actually foraging in grass, especially young ones that are like 6-7 years old and under. Because they're such tactile learners still. Grass is there's a lot of sensory stuff going on in the grass, from the blades of grass to the different plants to the dirt below it to, a slimy slug. So the kids actually, you can get them to focus on a patch of grass for far longer than you actually think you'd be able to. But you got to sit there and you got to show them, oh, well, let's pick this plant, let's taste it, let's, do that sort of thing. So.
Yeah. And that makes me think about, with kids, how does foraging actually help develop like the taste palette too, and like their perception of tastes and likes and dislikes?
Yeah, so I'm all about for the incorporation of more wild foods into our diets, and for several reasons. But specifically, when we dissect this on a gastronomic level and how it registers on the palate. So, for example, generally speaking, bitter foods tend to be really good for us, loaded with antioxidants, anti-carcinogenic compounds. Very, very, they're quote, even though I don't really like the term superfood because all foods are super,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Like we can't necessarily compare a potato to an acai berry to kale. Like each one has attributes and nutritional profiles and tastes and flavors that make it unique and different. So, but we can say, like, eat each one in moderation. Like don't overdo it with any of these. So I don't necessarily like the concept of superfoods, but these wild foods haven't been selectively bred the way that some of our homogenized, industrialized agricultural products have been. All right. So you guys are the antithesis of that. right?
Right.
You are breeding for taste and flavor, and then you're folding in with, appearance probably secondary after that for you guys, and then transportation, all that stuff that everybody else puts first, right, for the modern
Mm-hmm.
world. So these wild foods haven't been bred for that, so they are very flavorful and very potent. So I feel incorporating some of them in early life, in early childhood, it allows your child to be used to these flavors, these tastes, right? Because even now, one of the most bitter foods anybody would eat would be maybe a radicchio, a treviso, something along those lines, something in the endive family, an escarole. Um, you know, there's so many plants in the wild that have those similar flavor profiles, but aren't necessarily cultivated. So I think introducing them at a younger age will allow people to, whether the child likes it or not, eventually small amounts can be normalized.
Mm-hmm.
So it allows, I feel, an individual that enjoys a wider range of tastes. Okay. And me, I'm fortunate in that aspect because I have a very low density of bitter taste buds. So I virtually do not pick up on bitter. I can feel a sensation associated with it, but I don't necessarily taste bitter, whereas somebody else would be gagging on something. So I can eat burnt food. I can just bite into a head of radicchio and eat it like an apple, and it just kind of tastes like a tingly lettuce to me. Um, so I have a very, very diverse palate in that I can eat those foods and enjoy them. And I think by incorporating small amounts of those, even in people that genetically may be a super taster or lean towards that, where they actually have a higher amount, a physical density of taste buds on their tongue that is more than someone like mine. Keeping those foods as an active part of the diet will allow for a more diverse diet in the long run, because
Yeah.
our taste bud density changes, our taste preference changes all throughout life in various modes. There are some predictable aspects, as such as later in life being more sensitive to assertive tastes, right? Things like salt, acid, and sugar just being too intense for an older palate. And that's just because of neuron fatigue and how the trigeminal nerve runs and connects to all these taste buds and stuff in the tongue. So we know that, but early life, there's so many different factors that can influence the taste preference. So if you do have a child that is a stubborn eater and not eating a lot of things, there could be some ways that you can subtly sync some of these flavors cooked into the food that they may be able to detect very low amounts. You're not detecting at all, but you can do them in low amounts to get them used to them being there. Okay. And hopefully they'll continue to enjoy eating them. And other things that you can do too is I really think making sure children inherently are going to eat what their body needs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if we provide them with the right food choices, they will eat the foods that are appropriate to them. And you may end up with a child that just wants to eat toast and fruit, and that may be their palate and what they enjoy. And you may end up with a child that wants to eat salad, greens, and mushrooms at every meal. You may have, somewhere in between. But as long as you are not putting out, can I say shit food?
Yeah.
Like as long as you're not like giving them food choices that are not good,
Right.
they're not going to make bad food choices for their bodies, especially as they're growing, they're developing. And some of us have different, we all have different metabolic rates. We all, have different nutritional needs for various reasons and different stages and different stages of growth and development. And children will inherently attune to that. It's when we provide them with things like chips and candy, and and don't get me wrong, like we enjoy eating those things in my house, and we do have bags of pretzels, and we like kettle chips. We have a bag in the cabinet right now, but it's not an everyday option. It's not an every meal option. So when we serve dinner at our house, we have a bunch of different foods. We don't plate up anybody's food and give them a plate of food and say you have to eat this. We let people take what they want to eat, and they can eat almost as much as any of anything that is offered to them, as long as there's enough to share with the other people. So, this way, kids pick and choose what they want to eat and that sort of thing. So, and if you're someone that's time crunched and, you don't cook or you maybe don't have time to, there's still great convenience options in various grocery stores. You guys do great produce boxes that show up at your doorstep. So you don't even have to grocery shop, but you can go to most grocery stores and buy pre-cut vegetables, pre-washed salad. So literally like just open a package and give them those options. It's just as easy to open up a bag of salad as it is a bag of potato chips.
Yep.
And it's so much better. So it's really just about, I feel, controlling the options that kids have. And then just if you give them foods, I've met children from all over the world that eat what we consider here in America various different ethnic foods, right? Because they're foreign to us and our culture. And the children eat, spicy food in curries in India that are highly spiced and hot in that regard. And there's children in Japan that eat sushi, and there's pregnant women in Japan that eat sushi for that matter. So it's what we're normalizing as cuisine and the food choices in America that we're seeing problems with, versus, like I said, it's just as easy to open a bag of salad as it is a bag of potato chips. Put the food choice out there for the child, give it to them, and you'll be better off for it. You'll be healthier because you're going to eat the same foods your kids are, because you're going to show them how good it is and how simple it is to enjoy it.
Oh my gosh, yeah. That brings up so much for me. The work of Fred Provenza. Have you seen the book Nourished? He talks about that in animals and food choices, and also like the work of I forget the researcher's name, but in orphanages, looking at giving like, I think it was like 40 different food choices on a table basically, and the children were allowed to independently choose, and each day they were independently choosing a different mix of foods, right?
Yeah.
And so I think,
and it's really interesting in social settings and in settings where there's multiple siblings, because peer pressure ends up playing a positive role with the picky ones.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yes. And it doesn't end up being why aren't you eating that? It ends up being the picky ones end up seeing everybody else eat, and they at least go to try it. They want to join the 1 bite or 2 bite club.
Yeah.
So it can have a positive effect from that standpoint.
Oh, I love that. As far as your kids go, do you have any recipes or any like go-to things that you make with foraged ingredients?
Well, so for us, like any of those ingredients are kind of like a normalized part of what we do. So I feel morel mushrooms, I like the taste of them way better after they've been dried and then rehydrated and cooked.
Okay.
I think the aroma is better and the taste is better. So we dry a lot of morels, and a go-to for us is like ramen noodle night. And nice. We'll just put the dried mushrooms in some water with a little miso, and that's our broth, and then just pour it over the noodles. And everybody, Millie can pick if she wants to put greens in there or if she just wants mushrooms and noodles and eats her salad on the side or whatever. So we don't have many that we don't necessarily have like pasta night in our house or Taco Tuesday or that sort of thing, because we're working with a restaurant and that sort of thing. But home is often a place where we test out various things that we'll then bring into the restaurant. Try to go through a kid test and then work it up from there. And
the biggest critics.
Yeah. And cooking is a way that my wife and I are both intellectually and stimulated, and knows also how we're entertained, and it can be very meditative for us too. So we don't like cooking the same thing over and over. So there's various times where it can be like 6 months or more before we kind of cook the same dish over. And there's some exceptions to that. There's a few times a week that Millie needs a quick mac and cheese meal, or we do hot dog night or Polish boy night here. So some of those things we do a little bit more cyclically than 6 months, more like 4 to 6 weeks. But there isn't much that we make a lot. Now, there are some things that we tend to order a lot. We tend to order a lot of Japanese food and sushi, and we tend to order a lot of Vietnamese food and pizza.
Oh, I love it. That's great. And I think you bring up such a good point that diversity is so important. And that's what I talk a lot about too with vegetables, even just not getting like into one single vegetable, like diversity and having a bunch of different colors and tastes and textures. Like that is so important because each vegetable or each plant brings thousands of different phytonutrients to the
Well,
table.
and this is really interesting too, because you don't necessarily play out at the grocery store, but you do
Mm-hmm.
see it play out at the farmer's market.
Yeah.
And here's the thing: you can go to the farm when you go to the grocery store. There's always a premium on the different variety of a product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The newest apple is the most expensive per pound, right? Compared to ones that have been on the market for a number of years and so on and so forth, right? Just a few years ago, Honeycrisp, the University of Wisconsin, their licensing period their patent period ended on it, and now it's hit the mass market. So if you've noticed, Honeycrisp this season, the past couple seasons, has been anywhere from 50 cents to $1 less per pound because people didn't have to pay licensing royalties to the plant developers anymore of
Wow.
it. And now
Yeah.
now this has a good and bad edge to it in agriculture, because the way that Honeycrisp was done, I feel, was done appropriately, because it was held within an educational institution, University of Wisconsin, I believe it was. They're plant breeders breeding apples and using traditional approaches and this sort of thing, which is often what you have to do with apples because of the complexity of their DNA. But they were like, listen, we spent a lot of money developing this. We need to recoup it. So they
Mm-hmm.
did. It's going to fund our agricultural sciences department. It's not going to fund something like a company like Monsanto or Bayer,
Right.
who's controlling seed stock and developing horrible pesticides and killing us all and creating millions and millions of dollars of debt for farmers who can never actualize the payments on it. No matter how new or efficient the technology is, it's just this horrible, never-ending loop. Anyways, I can quickly derail. But going back to like trying the different varieties, and why this is so easily accessible at the farmers market, maybe compared to the premiums you might pay on the purple asparagus or the white asparagus at the grocery store. Typically at the farmers market, the Honeycrisp isn't $1 more a pound. Kind of all the apples are the same price. They're growing them all at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. They're putting them out there, and you can find some amazing varieties that you'll never find at a grocery store. And the same goes for the different types of peppers and tomatoes and so on and so forth. So in the grocery store, you tend to get a premium for that. And because of that, it isn't always equally accessible for everybody, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
wide variety of people. There's some people I tend to shop at Heinen's and Miles Farmers Market and the Farmers Market, and I buy Farmer Direct. There's people that can't afford those stores. There's people that have to go buy fresh produce at Mark's.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is reality. But hopefully over time, when I was a kid, Mark's didn't offer fresh produce, so we're making progression. A
Yeah.
discount, bulk buy store that does offer fresh produce now, like that's a huge win. Okay,
Yeah.
even if it is just iceberg lettuce and imported Mexican tomatoes, who cares? The communities those stores exist in need them, and offering fresh food is a very, very important thing, especially compared to industrialized canned and processed and bagged and all sorts of preserved foods. So but people should try the different varieties of things. They taste different. They have different sugar contents and different protein contents and feels and aromas, and it try as many different foods as you can. You know,
Yeah. I
yeah.
couldn't agree more. It's fun being out at our farm market on the weekends. You see just like mounds of colorful vegetables, and like you said, even if it's in within one vegetable category like cauliflower, we had a purple, orange, the white, and it's just like you can get so
So
many different
and
phytonutrients within that one category.
right, and here's a really interesting thing too, because there's a lot of things that happen psychosomatically in the brain with these
Mm,
foods too. So certain associations, let's take cauliflower, right?
yeah.
A cruciferous vegetable, it's a brassica. Anything in that family has a lot of sulfur compounds in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can smell it when they're cooking some cooking methods, and you can smell it when it comes out of you. All right?
Yep.
It's very apparent. So some people are put off by like steamed cauliflower, steamed broccoli because of this. But sometimes just because there's a purple one or an orange one or a green one, or we say, here's a Romanesco. It's not a cauliflower. It's a bit different, much sweeter taste, and loves to be poached in butter. Eat it with some lobster. It's kind of flipping the switch, and it's like, oh, in this color I like this food, but in that color I don't.
Mm-hmm.
So we can experience some things like that. And then over time, as somebody enjoys it of the color, or maybe it's a variety of tomato that's a little sweeter than other, whatever it is that they're enjoying, maybe over time, what happens is they go back to the food they didn't like because they realize in some cases, like in the brain, it's just a color. Now there's all these different nutritional, facts that go behind those colors and what compounds produce them and everything. But the brain is just like, oh, it's just a color. It's not looking for the nuance when eating and enjoying. So if we can take a different colored food or a different variety of a food and get someone to enjoy it and expand their palate, and then they understand like, oh, further on we make this connection to our food and biodiversity and the shrinking wild world. There's a
Mm-hmm.
direct correlation here. When we don't have 50 varieties of apples available to sell, that is a problem because that's a lack of biodiversity, and that leads to extinction. That leads to destruction. All right. If we don't have 100 varieties of lettuce, I want to see 20 varieties of horseradish at the grocery store. All right. And if different farming zones across the country and different farmers opt to grow these different varieties for different reasons and let the market sort out which ones are going to be more valuable or less valuable, and thus where they'll go, they'll still be available and accessible for people and people to experience. But when we limit our seed stocks and everything, we only grow one variety or two varieties of things. And as we're experiencing now with the banana,
Yeah.
if you like bananas, you better be eating them fresh in the next like couple of years, because there is a very, very high probability. It's like upper 90s right now that the Cavendish banana, the banana that the world eats, is going extinct, and there's no way they can reverse it at this point. So other bananas are being developed to fill this void. That this is going to be a huge crush. This market's going to collapse.
Yeah.
They're racing to replace a commercial variety of banana that a lot of people like, but we've been so monocropped on our palates that
Mm-hmm.
people believe this is the only banana, the only way a banana should look, taste, feel, smell, and appear. So now when we're trying to incorporate the bananas into the market to literally save an industry from collapsing, we can't even do it. So we need as many varieties of many different foods as possible at our markets for people to enjoy and to experience. This is how we save things in the modern world via gastronomy. It's the one thing that we can connect to on a personal level with every individual. And no matter whether you live to eat or eat to live, there is one food that every person loves that if you explain to them that that will no longer be available to them because of these things, that they're willing to make some adjustments to make sure that it is available to them. So they might be willing to eat a different variety of banana that maybe has brown skin, and literally the skin has to rot completely before it's even sugary and ripe. But the fruit is firm and soft underneath, like getting people to understand these things about the variances of these varieties. We really need it. There's a ton of education that has to be done. And whether this is done in the public sector or whether it's done through, government and NGOs, everybody needs to be working on this problem right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think this just statistic right now is including animals and plants. It's like 12 is the number of species that is most common in like the standard American diet. And
Yeah.
is from a diversity standpoint, that's terrible, right? Like at
Yeah.
the farm, we're growing like 600 to 800 different varieties of vegetables every year. And to
Right.
think of only 12, including animals, like that's not a lot of options.
No, no. And the problems we get with this lack of genetic diversity, all right? So
Yeah.
a cow that was raised for meat production in the Alps is not suitable to graze in the American West.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. In the Great Plains. All
Mm-hmm.
right. Differences in elevation, the needs of the animal, the weather patterns, all sorts of things. But industrialized agriculture has said, oh, we could just breed this one that kind of does everything, and it'll get to market faster. We do all this, it gets the big muscles, yada, yada. It's consistent. All these things happen. And then a virus in the wild mutates or a bacteria mutates. And that one breed is now ultra susceptible to some sort of infection, some sort of natural thing that without the hyper stylized breeding in a wider environment, it may have been able to resist or weather through, but it doesn't anymore. And then when the majority of the market share relies on one breed of animal or plant, and that animal goes through a collapse, and we have to rebuild systems with other breeds, it's a mess. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're going through now. So basically, we've come out of the Industrial Revolution. We went through the Green Revolution, end of World War II into the 70s. And hopefully now we're going through the re-greening
Yeah.
revolution, right? Where we've taken all the lessons we've learned from the past 70 years and we're able to attune things to harmonize better with the world that we live in now. All right. Because sustainability is not about overtaking and replicating. It's about working within the systems that we have. All
Mm-hmm.
right. There's a lot of land out there still, you know,
Yeah.
but there is not a lot of land out there.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to work within what we have. And we have to also start opening up the possibility of having agricultural centers back in cities. So I honestly feel too that Cleveland is in the greater Cleveland area and maybe some of the sister cities around the Great Lakes, because we will be the refuge zone for a lot of the world as climate change destroys some areas. Look at the water problems in the West right now. We're not going to have those here. We're a temperate zone. It may not be warm weather year round. It's going to be like that pretty soon, though. And we have the largest freshwater resource in the world right here. So I distinctly feel that like cities like Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit, Toledo, Youngstown, these Rust Belt cities that have rusted out along the Great Lakes are going to be major, major harbors for people. And we need to have innovative infrastructure set up with our existing resources to be able to accommodate these people in the future.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And that's, I think, the opportunity in Cleveland, especially, is huge. And there's some exciting stuff going on. I just talked to Chef Ismail Samad over in East Cleveland, and he's doing a
Yeah.
lot of great stuff. So I think,
In East Cleveland, which is like,
yeah.
for those not listening or watching that aren't aware, East Cleveland is a separate city from Cleveland.
Hmm.
There's been many discussions over many years about Cleveland annexing it in, but it is literally one of the most decrepit and poor places in the United States.
Hmm.
It is it's a community that needs immense amounts of love and resources. And because of various things from segregationist policies and racist laws to corruption of their city government and everything, it just doesn't get any better. It's been like this for years and years and years. So to hear that Chef Ismail is doing something there and fostering community and showing people that like, listen, we can't be defeated by ourselves. Like that's what we're doing right now, showing that he's doing that. Fantastic.
Yes. Koji, so you wrote an amazing book, Koji
Oh, thank you.
Alchemy. Yeah, and I love your TED Talk. I watched it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. So, tell us about Koji. I mean, some listeners may not even know what Koji is. So let's start there. And then how did you get so into Koji?
Sure. So Koji it's a mold. All right. We're used to molds in our daily life. Whether you recognize them as molds that are good for us or bad for us, because there's a mix of those, is inconsequential. But throughout your daily life, whether you are spraying black mold in your shower or you just ate a piece of chocolate or some charcuterie or some cheese, you have experienced mold in one way or another. So, the leftovers, the back of your fridge. So some of these molds are great for us, and some of these molds actually create delicious foods. And koji is one of those molds. It's believed it was domesticated roughly around the same time as rice. It likes to grow on rice. And what it does, so importantly, when it grows on rice, not only does it make the rice very delicious tasting, okay, but it converts all of the starch in rice. So rice is full of all this starch. And starch is made up of little types of sugars, simple sugars. When we eat a starch, our bodies can't necessarily break apart those sugars. We can't necessarily take starches and ferment them into things like alcohol or other foods. So we rely on this koji mold to do it for us. And when it grows on rice, it turns it like honey sweet. It can also turn it to taste something like a Sour Patch Kid, because some of the varieties of the mold actually produce citric acid as they're growing. So there's a lot of really fun things it can do from flavor, but it allows us to take essentially foods that could not be transformed or fermented on their own, high starch ingredients, and allows us to break down their starches so we can ferment them. And this is all done through these very specialized types of proteins called enzymes. So the mold grows, and fungi are very much like us in some respects, because they grow and they secrete their digestive juices on their food. They grow on their food, and they like rub it. They like squirt this stuff through their skin, and they rub it all over their food, right? So imagine you're sitting there, you got a cheeseburger in front of you, right? And you got digestive juices that can squirt out your hands. You're just rubbing all over the burger, and then you make a slop, and then it just sucks right back into your hands. Okay, that's kind of what fungi do. All right, they're the inside of their stomach is on the outside of their body, and they break everything down, and then they soak up the minuscule slop through their body tissues. But when they do that, when certain molds do that, it's very delicious for us. Okay, so not only does it create free sugars that we can then ferment, so then we could turn rice into alcohol, right? We could ferment it into alcohol if sugar's present. If sugar isn't present, we can't ferment rice into alcohol. It just doesn't work that way. It wouldn't even work on that way on an alien planet. Maybe, hopefully, life might work. Hopefully, if we find life that isn't carbon-based, it will work differently. But in carbon-based systems, this is how it works. There's no other way around it. So it also creates a lot of umami flavor, which is savory. So whether you're someone that loves Cool Ranch Doritos or you love sauteed morel mushrooms, both of those contain lots of umami compounds that register on your tongue as very delicious and savory. Koji also creates aromas and molecules, aromatic molecules and tastes when it breaks down fats. That's aroma is purely based on the breakdown of fats or the transitioning of fats from one thing to another. So going from a fat to a fatty acid and an ester, you produce these aromatic compounds. And koji can do this. And koji, we can actually dial in. If we grow it on certain things, we can produce very intentional aromatic compounds and very intentional types of these oglio and minuscule sugars that maybe don't taste sweet, but act sweet in a fermentation sense. We can do all this really crazy customization just by changing the variety of mold we're growing. And these are all laboratory process molds. They come out of a regulated industry in Japan. They're analyzed in a laboratory. They're not in like some rustic Japanese cedar-lined little facility. No, there's a modern 21st century laboratory they produce these in to make sure they're safe for use and for food production and everything. So as long as you're sourcing them properly, you have no concerns of what your preconceptions of mold does to food. Won't happen with these molds for food. But at its most connectedness, koji is what makes miso and soy sauce and sake. And I guarantee everybody listening to this podcast, and I guarantee over 95% of households in America have at least one packet of soy sauce in the kitchen. So this is something that has touched all of our lives, influenced all of our cooking for millennia. And in the West, we're just kind of getting hip to it. We're just kind of getting to it. And keep in mind, the majority of the world's populations have been in Asia, in cultures that use koji or use their named equivalent of it, right? On a mycological level, they're all the same species and variants of these molds, but each culture, for various reasons, ceremonial reasons, cultural integrity, the rights of their language and people, they all have their own names for these different molds, all right? And they all use them from India to Japan, from Mongolia and even parts of northern Russia that border it, down through the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia. It's a very wide area, and most of the world's population is contained in that area. So the argument is actually that most of the world has known about this and been using it, and they haven't kept it a secret, but we've been so stupid to accept it over here because we're fear mongers and we think anything that's different is wrong. So when we talk about mold growing on food and making it more delicious, we're like, I don't know about that.
I know. I can kind of hear my mom in the background like, that's not safe. Don't eat that,
Yeah.
And there's that element. And I think that's with foraged foods too, and mushrooms and all the
Well,
things of
sure,
like,
we've all, and as
yeah.
the more we terraform our planet, the more we create. I mean, look, I'm sitting in my living room right now talking to you, like the thermostat's right behind me.
Yeah.
It's and we use a lot of heat in my house. My house is set to 75 degrees right
Ooh.
now.
Yeah.
That's where we keep it when
Yeah.
it is not that hot or hotter outside. So, yeah, we'll turn it down tonight. But
Yeah.
I'm here. I'm cold, and that's where it's at.
Yeah.
So yeah, like we all live in very comfortable environments compared
Right.
to what we evolved to live in. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the big things we have to look at too is, and I often hear the argument, well, ancient Rome was industrialized. And yes, it was. It was industrialized with grain production and everything, but we didn't see modern die off of varieties of plants, varieties of animals going extinct, really, really until the Industrial Revolution. Certain things have happened here and there. Yes, they have, but the majority of it has happened from, let's say, the Civil War onward. If we use that as a marker in American history, it's greatly accelerated since then, since we've started burning fossil fuels widely in the environments. So we really actually kind of need to look back to antiquity, because their systems of storage and industrialization for agriculture, they were sustainable. They
Right.
didn't rely on fossil fuels. They relied on wind power and water power. They relied on currents and drafts and well-designed systems that could accommodate those. So we need to put on our 21st century thinking caps and revisit a lot of those systems. I have a friend who has an olive farm in southern Tuscany. They are being obliterated by climate change right now. It's really, really bad. It's affecting the crop horribly. He's predicting that within the next 25 years, his region will no longer be able to grow the olives they've been growing. So, and these are olives that they've been these varieties in this part of Italy, they've been growing them since antiquity. And he's starting to consider whether he has to start looking at varieties that are adapted to the Sahara that might grow in Morocco and other parts of northern Africa right now to grow. And he's 45 minutes north of Rome by train.
Wow.
So
That's crazy.
it's depending on where you live right now, it's hitting areas hard and destroying some livelihoods. So we in talking with Lorenzo, he actually excavated 3,200-year-old aqueducts on his property that were put there as irrigation channels because it has always been agricultural lands for the most part. So instead of him having to rely on a system that uses electricity or burning fossil fuels and pumping water all over his farm and, broad scale irrigation, he literally dug out a bunch of dirt out of some work that people did 3,200 years ago, and it works perfectly, and all his fields are irrigated.
Wow. That's amazing. And that's
Yeah.
Farmer Lee says that all the time, not to that degree, but that, we're just trying to get as good as people were a couple hundred years ago at farming, right? And that's really
Yeah.
regenerative agriculture. Like, how do we get back to really caring for the land and farming in harmony with nature versus this like total extractive process?
Right, right. And, just as we talk about eating everything in moderation, whether you want to go out for ice cream and a hot dog at the ball game, like we have that right, we have that availability of those foods. We should enjoy them, right? There's hedonistic pursuit in eating is very important, in my opinion. All
Yeah.
right. So we should have those foods, but we should be able to produce them in ways that don't destroy everything. We should be
Mm-hmm.
able to enjoy them in ways that they're not filled with things that are destroying our body and that we're destroying the environment to get.
Yeah.
We can do all of this in moderation. We literally, we're on the cusp of technologies right now that are literally going to allow us to have our cake and eat it too. We just have to put a little bit more focus into really preserving what we have that's left
Mm-hmm.
before we take more that we don't necessarily need. I mean, honestly, in the next 50 years, the Large Hadron Collider, CERN, we are going to be powered by fusion reactions relatively shortly here.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have unlimited clean energy. We're going to be able to take that energy and expand across the universe and visit the stars. We're going to be able to, the things that we can do on this planet with unlimited, clean, free energy. I mean, think if you didn't have an electric bill. Think if we didn't even need that infrastructure, think about all these things where the generation of power to power everything you have around you and create everything. Look at everything in the environment you have around you right now. It's completely man-made and artificial.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a lot of energy requirements. We're not that far away from having these things. All right. So we need to protect what we have, and we really need to invest in these technologies that are going to bring about a clean, harmonious future for us.
Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit of an aside, but back onto Koji. As far as
Yeah.
farming with Koji too. I heard you mention that, and I think in your TED talk maybe that there's like applications outside of just food. Have you
Yeah.
seen anyone using Koji in like farming applications?
So there are, and there are some small market gardeners that are using Koji in fermentation processes, dealing with their compost for specific nutrient
Mm-hmm.
extraction and production. So that is being used. There's a number of people looking at it as kind of like a seed coat inoculant,
Oh,
seeing where that might
interesting.
go. And there's also people now that it's wild relatives of Koji that are toxic to us do this naturally, where they grow on they call it trash. It's organic trash. That's what you call little bits of corn husks and bits of dried plants and stuff that were left over from the growing season that's all poking up out of your soil and stuff. It's called
Mm-hmm.
organic trash because it should be worked into the soil, right? It shouldn't be visible so it can break down. So there's people experimenting right now with, can we use okay, so the wild varieties grow on there, they help break it down, but some of these domestic varieties where we've pushed up the ability to produce extra amounts of enzymes and all this through these breeding techniques we've been able to do, and this is all through traditional conventional, just like Gregor Mendel was doing, very similar
Yeah.
styles of breeding. So
Wow.
it hasn't changed much, but we could bring some of these varieties we've developed out into the wild world again and sprinkle them on. And because they're relatives, because they're there and they produce these much more enzymes, they will grow on those decomposing corn husks and hopefully break them down at a rate that could be exponentially faster, 6, 7, 8, even 10 times, depending on the environments that these are out in. Now, some of these are selective for different climates around the world, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
not going to be a one size fits all application, but we've already seen since the start of the Green Revolution in the late 1940s, Koji has been grown and produced on industrial scales to extract its enzymes for laundry detergents and dishwashing detergents.
Oh,
So, like,
wow.
as I said, like in the next 50 years, we're gonna have some really cool, exciting things because we literally have been working with some of these things in laboratory settings already for 50 or 75 years. Just nobody knows about it. All right.
Yeah.
And we're in the information age where you can have anything you want at any time. If you have enough money, you can literally obtain any source of data or any physicality that you want if you have enough personal resources right now. If you dream it, you can have it. All right.
That's
Whatever fetish
incredible.
you're into, whatever drives
Yeah.
your hobby, like anything. All right. So, you know, seeing that Koji can be a part of the application of these new technologies is really, really filling. I mean, there's groups that work with NASA that are looking at, well, if we take Koji and its relatives, there's all these families of molds out into space, right? And we're going to terraform a planet and we need someplace to live. Like, we're taking this little package and it can grow into this huge food item, right? Because the spore is infinitesimally small. If you dipped your finger in a pile of Koji spores, there could be hundreds of millions on your fingertip. Okay.
Wow.
So we could take something up into space that has similar needs and requirements as us, because most fungi respire like us. They kind of breathe like us. You know, a lot of them do, especially the ones we use for food. So the environments we'll be living in, we can grow them in. We won't have to have an extra set of resources, right? Like plants can help us create these circular environments where they're taking our waste product, and we can also incorporate them with some other microbes. And there's really cool stuff going on. Basically,
oh my gosh.
These molds and things like cyanobacteria, there's different types of algae that actually secrete calcium carbonate. Like, they secrete concrete onto a structure as they grow, and you can eat them. They're an algae, like they're a seaweed.
Wow.
You know, so we Koji is part of this kind of pantheon of these new age microbes that we're looking at, that these were probably some of, or their relatives, some of the first microbes to really start to colonize land on our planet in general. So now we're like, we've come full circle, right? Like, now we're finally realizing how important they are. And they're like, if we're going to expand off world, if we're going to expand in world here, right? If we're going to start living on the bottom of the ocean in some places because we need to, if we're going to have to start living underground in some places where we have limited light and resource and these sorts of things, can we start with these small little packets of seed foods and allow them to grow on surfaces that we're using to habitate in?
Yeah.
Right? Could we be growing these on our walls, in our walls, and then slough them off and siphon them off through different pump systems? And we have different foods that we can make from these things, because with these base enzymes they're creating, we can manipulate them and affect proteins and fats and sugars in ways that we can create very specific nutrient profiles for people exploring new environments that, as they may need them, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of crazy things that are happening now, right?
Wow.
And we see mass market application of things with Koji and the alternative meat market. There's a number, whether they're using what we would classically call Koji or one of its relatives, but they're using these molds to grow on alternative proteins and knit it and mold it together into deli meat that you can slice.
Oh my gosh.
Or a burger patty that you can grill. So like, we're seeing the proof of concept here. We're seeing it hit mass market application. And all of that came out of the science that we've been doing in the years leading up to, so we can see if we can take these, you know, this is like ultimate doomsday prepping.
Yeah.
The expansion of humanity amongst the cosmos, right? Like, whether you look at it as because we're destroying our planet, or we are a very curious race.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know why they say curiosity killed the cat. You know, it hasn't killed us yet. And everything we see, we're like, I could envision a hotel right there. What is a hotel? Nobody knows, but let's put one there, right? We are a very curious race. You know, we explore every nook and cranny of everything. Compared to other species on this planet, we are the most curious. So we will be expanding. We will be exploring. That the hope is that we can use things like Koji, regenerative agriculture, sustainable food systems to get us to the point where we can do all these wonderful things that our ancestors maybe couldn't even dream of.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So our podcast is called Farming for Health. And when you think of farming for health, what comes up for you?
You know, for me, it's really interesting because even though I don't actively farm land anymore, I've kind of left that land, but that life behind. I still work in the outdoors and I have a garden at my house and stuff, but I'm not a full-time farmer anymore. I still consider myself a full-time farmer. I'm a farmer of microbes. So I maintain these beautiful fields of perfectly cooked flowing rice and barley that millions and millions of connections of fungi grow on and thrive and turn into these fluffy white clouds. And I culture huge jars of sauerkraut where I look after the health and well-being of billions and billions of bacterium. So that's the farming for health that I do. And directly with those two, most of these organisms tend to be symbiotic with us in various ways. So they tend to promote our healthfulness in numerous of our systems, from pulmonary to neurological. It's not just digestive, we found out. So I definitely feel like I'm farming for a lot of health.
Oh, I love it. That's so cool. That's one of the best answers. That's amazing. So this has been absolutely fascinating. I know that people are going to want to learn more about you and connect with you and come to your restaurant. Tell us where we can find you.
So you can find me at Larder Delicatessen Bakery. My book, which you mentioned before, it's Koji Alchemy. So it's not just my book. I co-wrote it with one of my great friends, Richard Shih. We've been on this Koji adventure together. He's a brilliant individual. So definitely look up Koji Alchemy. It's our combined voice in there, both our passion for Koji. So you can find it that way. And most of our social media for the restaurant, etc., we are at Larder DB.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Farming for Health. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Connect with Farmer Lee Jones and I on Instagram and Facebook.